Hello and welcome everybody to another puzzle challenge video with chessuniversity.com. This is Ryan Murphy, and we're still in the intermediate difficulty phase of our week for the puzzles, and I'm going to go over the solution to yesterday's puzzle, which was also an intermediate difficulty puzzle. So here it was black to play and try to find the best continuation. If you haven't already seen this one, do take a moment to pause if you want to try to solve it, because I'm going to proceed with the solution in just a moment. Okay. So in the game, I can tell you that Queen f6 was chosen, which has the correct idea, trying to take advantage of the focal point on f2 for the attack, the twofold attack of the bishop and the queen, and also attacking the knight. And then white actually went wrong immediately because they played the sort of greedy and, I guess, sort of consistent follow-up from their previous move, knight takes c7 check. But the problem is, after king d7, they realized that now the knight is hanging, and also mate is difficult to stop, so white had to lose this knight, and then black was up a piece. So queen f6 is the right idea, but the reason it doesn't work is white can play knight takes bishop. And this removes the threat from the knight, because the knight traded itself off, and it gets rid of one of the pieces that was attacking f2. So now when black recaptures, they're simply down a pawn from earlier, plus their structure's ruined, and they have no attack. White will be able to castle immediately if they want to, and yeah, black just has no compensation really for the missing material. So the correct idea is to attack f2, but since this move is in the position, this knight takes bishop move, you need to do it with tempo, which means you want to look at your most forcing moves, which means we're looking at checks. So bishop takes f2 calls attention to itself and is in fact the best move. And the point is, of course, that after takes, queen f6 check, you pick up the knight. On the next move, you equalize the material, and white has lost the right to castle. And if they don't take the bishop, that's just as good. King f1, for example, you can play either simply by defending these pawns with, say, queen d7 or queen e7, in which case white can give up the knight and do something like this, but still they can't castle. Black can castle. In this position, white would be a pawn up, but I still think black has decent comp. The knight's going to develop, rook f8 is going to come, knight d4 is going to come. Black has good activity, and this king's a bit awkward on f2. Yeah, basically that covers everything. You could also play queen f6 and be more aggressive, because you're threatening discoveries with the bishop. And a line like this, I think black still has very reasonable attacking chances. Rook f8 is a move that's definitely on the agenda. And even though both kings are weak, I would think that white's king is in more danger. I mean, there's more black pieces that are able to quickly come to the f-file. So anyway, that's the solution to yesterday's puzzle. Bishop takes f2 with the idea of queen f6 if the sacrifice is accepted, and even if it's not. So with that one covered, we're now going to move to our new position, where it is white to play and find the best move. Now, funny enough, and this is sort of a unique thing about this particular puzzle, or the game it comes from anyway, this came from a Fischer Random game I was playing within the last week against a friend of mine. And it was, I think, a 10 plus 5, time control, 10-minute with a 5-second increment. And I was playing black in this position, and white had a chance to, I don't want to say equalize, but white definitely had a chance to not go down in flames here. And it involves some nice tactics, which is why I've included it as our daily puzzle. So it's white to play here and try to find the best way out. They're obviously in a fork. If the queen just moves to any random square and black gets to take the rook with check, then black is already going to be up a couple of pawns, and that's going to be a pretty good endgame for black. So that's the task for you. Try to find the best way for white. Okay, and I do want to go back to the beginning. Now, there won't be as much sort of opening theory usefulness from this one, because reviewing a Fischer Random game, obviously, it depends heavily on the starting position. It's definitely not the same starting position from a regular game of chess. So yeah, we'll talk about general principles. We'll talk about some tactical moments maybe, but for the most part, we're going to be not focusing too heavily on the opening because it's largely irrelevant, let's say. Okay, so d4, d5, c4, c6. In a previous game where I had the white pieces in this position, my friend had played pawn takes pawn, and we got a really exciting game. I played a boring move and got a boring position, and then later made it more exciting by taking some ridiculous risks. Bishop h5. Black wanted to keep the bishop pair. I was basically aiming for a slop setup, trying to make this as normal as possible. Maybe the bishop comes to d6, knight comes to f6. The knight on e8 maybe has to figure stuff out. But yeah, that was my general idea. Anyway, so castles. knight gf6, and bishop a3 check, which I think is a reasonable idea here. It's definitely not the only way to play it, but basically either I will have to walk into a pin, I'll lose castling rights by having to move my king, or I'll play the move that I did in the game, which is bishop to d6, whereafter my dark squares are a little bit vulnerable because I've put all my pawns on light squares. So that's like a general bit of strategic advice. So I did play bishop d6, and the trade did happen, which in some sense helps black because it develops the knight. So yeah, this was definitely not the end of the world. And I do think I'm supposed to block with the bishop. I don't think moving the king is correct, and I also think walking into a pin is generally not the way to do things. So I think this was all pretty good. And now g4, which I thought was pretty risky. Simply getting my bishop off this diagonal, forcing me here, which just kind of encourages some trades. And then knight e5 was played, trying to go after my bishop, I assume. Also making room for the other knight to come to f3, which makes sense because this knight doesn't have, I mean, besides d3, f3 is like the only other reasonable square. So this is definitely logical. Now, if I didn't want my bishop to be taken by a knight, I could have immediately played bishop takes on b1 here as black. But I was kind of hoping that at some point white would release the tension and take on g6, and I would be able to take with the h-pawn and open up the rook file. And even though it looks weird, I think it's still legal for me to castle queenside in this position as black, based on how Fischer random works. So I could actually try to use the h-file to attack. Anyway, that didn't happen. I went for a trade of knights with knight d7, takes, knight f3, the other knight's going to come to e5, and here I decided to be, I don't even want to say greedy, I'm just going to say dumb, because my next move after knight f3, it just doesn't work. I think a much better move would have been f6, preventing the knight into e5, but I just took on c4, simply overlooking that after knight e5, the knight's going to be able to protect the c4 square, so that's pretty bad. So yeah, dc4 not a good idea. Giving up the center if you can't actually win a pawn is usually not a good thing to do. So yeah, knight e5 is a nice twofold useful multi-purpose move. So rook d8 back, pawn takes on c4, and then this is where I decided to be super greedy and make the position way sharper than it needed to be, and also quite risky, I think. I took on b1, and I played f6, and I said, give me this pawn. Give me this pawn on c4. And it looks like I can actually get away with it. I did a little bit of analysis with my friend after the game, and even though it looks really sketchy to be playing f6, because, you know, never play f6 with all the internet memes, yeah, it's still a pawn. I'll get a d5 square for my knight later. I can tuck my king on f7. I can still technically castle. So it's actually somewhat reasonable, and it sharpens up the game for sure. So knight d3 back, take on c4, and then knight c5 played. And this is, I think, probably where things start to heat up quite a bit. So I played king f7, protecting my pawn. And my sincere hope was here that we'd get to some endgame, because even though the endgame is probably good for... even though the endgame is probably good if they take on b7 for white, I think, it's still like very easy to play. Both sides have weak pawns. I'll maybe play like rook b8. Other rook can come to d8 if the knight moves. But yeah, it's definitely better for white. They've got the strong square on c5 and the bigger center. So anyway, but he didn't want the endgame, and I kind of knew that, so that's why I played king f7. Queen b3 was played instead of the trade, trying to eye my knight, obviously, but also the e6 pawn indirectly. So now b5 is kind of like, I would say, forced. You don't want to walk into queen takes e6. So b5 was played, then rook to d3. I think the idea was to play something like rook f3 or rook g3 in combination with g5. So here I decided to be a little bit feisty, and I fought back with h5. And h5 I was actually sort of happy with. I mean, it made the game completely nuts after g5, but yeah, I don't know. I just kind of wanted to provoke him a little bit. So g5 was played, and it's the best move. Now rook d5 is played. f4, continuing to push. And now basically, this is actually a sort of important strategic moment. What I was actually trying to do when I played h5 is I actually wanted to get his pawns on dark squares and then put my pawns on light squares and just create like a total block of the position, which is essentially what happened. After f4, I played f5, and my intention is to go g6, and then the moment this knight ends up on e5, just to snap it off and just try to hold the position on the light squares. And that was my game plan. I'm trying to hold off the move e4, keep my rook planted on this square. So yeah, once I managed to get the pawn to f5, I was reasonably optimistic that my king was at least safe. So here, white tried a very interesting move, g6. Question is, what would you guys do here? This is a very tricky moment. I think I definitely picked the worst possible king move here. But it's tough anyway. So I played king f6 as black, and yeah, it's not a good move. King's very vulnerable here, and my opponent was very well justified in playing e4 and trying to open up the center, which is exactly what he did. But obviously, I didn't want to take here and allow this knight potentially to like reroute itself into g5. Also, like there's rook g3 to consider. So this looked way too risky. But apparently, I was supposed to put the king on g8, which to me was slightly counterintuitive because it gives up this pawn also. But I think the point is if I put the king back on g8, it's slightly safer. I mean, it's more than slightly safer than it would be out on f6. And if white does go ahead and grab this pawn, let's say, right, there's this nice point where you can go queen c8, attacking the knight. Now the knight has to go back. Well, I mean, it doesn't have to, but it's reasonable to expect that it would, or it would go to g5, let's say. g5 is a more active square. And now, after knight g5, funny enough, the pawn on g6 actually can just be collected like this. Just rook h6, rook g6. Had I seen this maneuver, probably I would have played king g8, but the reason I avoided it is I was worried my rook was just going to be stuck on h8. So anyway, that was a pivotal moment, I think. And now after e4, white's got a really dangerous attack. Takes, king takes pawn. And yeah, this should look, I mean, it looks dangerous. It looks like white's just completely winning here, but it's actually not simple at all. If you throw this at your computer, it's going to kind of wildly go up and down, and it'll eventually settle around something close to 0, which just means it's really complicated. All right, so anyway, I played king h6 because obviously, like, that's the safest place for my king. Queen f3, bringing the queen into the attack. Pretty logical move. And now I played rook f5. I figured that the threat here was rook g5 from white, and I wanted to play the move g6 to shore up my h5 square. But when I did this, I didn't want to allow a knight f6 check, so I started with the move rook f5. I hope that logic makes sense. Like I'm basically envisioning like this. I want to play this, and I don't want knight f6 check to enter into the equation ever. Not that it immediately wins or anything, but in some positions it could be quite annoying. And if my rook was on d5, it would win the rook in some positions. So yeah, that's the basic logic behind rook f5. So rook f5 was played, rook g5 played by white anyway, and now g6, which was my whole point. I could also defend this pawn with queen e8. This is the other option, but I went with g6. And now king h2 was played by white. And black has a lot of moves here that are apparently very good. Black's supposed to be doing quite well here, even though it looks kind of scary to be playing black's position. I think bringing the queen to f8 would have been a little bit more secure. I mean, there's a lot of moves that are better here. Rook g8 is very secure holding onto this g6 square because white's going to try to double up in a lot of cases. But I played the trickiest, like the move that's sort of the most hidden and also like not directly defending g6. I played queen b8 as black here, just using the pin. So sort of pinning this pawn on f4, potentially introducing the ideas of trading rooks. Yeah, so queen b8 was played, now knight g3, attacking my rook on f5. And here I played knight d2, which is one of the best moves. I think what else can be played here? I could also just move my rook. Rook f6 is reasonable. But knight d2 is tricky, so I played knight d2. And now after takes, I took back with the e-pawn. And this is our key position from the start of the video. So hopefully you guys will take some time to try to solve this one. If you do, you can either make a comment on YouTube or check out chessuniversity.com. I'll put the link for the official post in the description. If you post there, you can get reward points on the website. So I know it's a bit different to be covering a Fischer Random game, but I still think there's a lot of like instructive chess content in Fischer Random, and I think it kind of spices things up a bit. So I enjoy playing the variant. So hopefully you guys liked it. Hopefully you guys can solve it. Again, white to play and find the best way out of this. All right, see everyone tomorrow. Thanks for watching.